Hey guys, it's Cassie again. Today I'm going to be talking about paving the sponge, Houston's flood issues. So let's get started. So, first, I'm going to talk about zoning, what it really is, and what are some means of doing so. Then, I'm going to touch on zoning in Texas specifically, who participates, and why. After, I'm going to discuss impacts of development on watersheds as flooding has seen to increase globally due to climate change. After, I will discuss a pretty big flood that happened present day, which is Hurricane Harvey, and some of the mental and physical consequences that occurred because of it. I will then follow up with some other case studies that I will apply back to Houston, Texas, then state my research question and talk about the GIS I used to answer it. I'm going to start off talking about zoning because, in my personal opinion, I feel like it's a pretty important factor in why Houston, Texas is so susceptible to flooding. So, first, I'm going to talk a little bit about what zoning is, just touching on a couple of main points, and then means of enforcing zoning will follow. So, zoning in the US is probably the most important method of land use regulation by local governments. It divides the jurisdiction into geographic zones, and local ordinances state what may and may not be done in each of these delegated zones. Now, it's important to note that the majority of land use law can be amended without the consent of affected property owners. Those are the couple main points that I want you to focus on. Now, zoning can be implemented in many ways. Some common ways of regulations are maximum height of buildings, max number of units allowed to be placed on the lot, minimum setbacks for a building from its neighborhood and street, etc., etc. Now that you know a little bit more about zoning, we're going to hone in on our specific area of interest, which in this case would be Texas. Now, in Texas, counties are not authorized to regulate land use. Instead, urban development policies are made by the private sector and business associations, except for limited daily urban needs like transportation and infrastructure. This is kind of mimicked in Houston in that it's the only major city in North America without zoning, as zoning is seen as a violation of private property and personal liberty. In this, public sector initiated urban policies are limited, especially at the neighborhood level. However, despite the lack of zoning, regulatory policies and limited plans made by the municipality have influence on urban development. Civic and private organizations, such as super neighborhoods, fill in the gaps of land use zoning. This is because land use restrictions offer property owners the possibility of operating in the forms of neighborhood civic clubs, homeowner associations, or community organizations. These groups press for development control regulations that protect property values and maintain amenities. Thus, together with politicians, bureaucrats, developers, and speculators, homeowners use development control as a means to meet their special interests. With our newfound knowledge on the importance of zoning in a community, we are going to now turn our attention to look at how development has impacted watersheds. And I thought this would be nice to include after our slides on zoning because I think it really brings home the point that no matter who is pushing for the development, maybe local government or a super neighborhood that just wants their property values to increase, it shows the negative effect that it has on the environment. I also think this is a great case study to kind of measure the change over time in Houston, Texas, because this area that we're looking at is actually in Houston, Texas. That's where the watershed is located. So I feel like although it can't be generalized for all of Texas, it's kind of shows nicely how development changes over time. With that, I'm going to first start by saying that urban sprawl is one of the most significant problems facing modern societies today and is present in Texas. It seems to be only limited by the amount of land available. Now, this model has led to the intense development of floodplains, which in turn has increased vulnerability to floods. Unfortunately, this means that there has been a lot of development in watersheds, and it's been seen that development alters the way it functions with respect to the flow of water, which means more constructions in the floodplain increases the potential to flood. Now, this experiment examines the impact of urban development, specifically on land, on a closed watershed over a 50-year period, and it connects the analysis of development in the watershed to the increased propensity for flooding or drought. To capture the greatest length and completeness of a historical record, developmental data for every property in the watershed was obtained from the Harris County Appraisal District. Now, each parcel is characterized in terms of location, boundary, area, and year of development to estimate the impervious footprints of buildings on the property. Outflow records during the period of development are essential to analyze the relationship. So, a recorded daily maximum for the flow from the mouth of the watershed was obtained from the USGS from June 1st, 1936 to December 31st, 2000. Precipitation data was obtained from NOAA, which determined rainfall in hundredths of an inch each day from January 1st, 1949 to December 31st, 2000. This data was combined using GIS to adjust spatial patterns of development and watershed output. Now, results were examined to determine how the patterns changed throughout the 50-year period. The study shows development during the 50-year period from 1948 to 2000 had a huge impact on water outflow performance. Rainwater more quickly vacated the watershed, increasing the potential for flooding. The flood mitigation measures taken in the period did not match the extreme pressure of population growth and land development. And I think this is really relevant as current natural disasters are proving to be very destructive compared to the mitigation that we have attempted to put in. I'm sure at this point most of you are wondering why this is so relevant to Texas and what this previous information has led us to at this point. In general, I wanted you to have the consensus that in the past, Houston has not made the best choices in regards to land development as a mitigation process to natural disasters. With that, we come to our present day disaster, Hurricane Harvey. It lasted about 5 days, and during those 5 days, 20 trillion gallons of rain fell on Texas. That's like 29 Olympic pools. I did the math, I crunched the numbers, it's 29 pools. Now, during the hurricane, residents also experienced cyclonic winds, tornadoes, storm surges along concave coastlines, and inland flooding. The mental and physical consequences of an event like Harvey are long lasting. Some physical consequences include mortality, such as drowning deaths in submerged vehicles, lacerations, puncture wounds, abrasions, and so on and so forth. Now, most of those occurred during cleanup activities, except, of course, the drowning deaths. Psychological consequences are associated with traumatic exposure to storm, losses and hardships, and disruption of vital care for those with chronic and persistent mental illness/cognitive impairment. Now, with these consequences in mind, much can be learned from Harvey. Translational science can be used to investigate societal issues that place special populations at disproportionate disaster risks. However, in our case, we really want to assess the impact that pavement and impervious covering has had on the draining of this water and the movement of it in regards to what happens during these natural disasters. As we've seen, historical development has gone in the wrong direction in Texas with regards to flooding. The increase has resulted in the decrease of watershed ability to retain and drain water. But what are some specific effects that pavement has on flooding? Current socioeconomic factors in Houston favor conversion for urban and suburban uses. As urbanization increases, impervious rooftops and transportation services become a major factor of the new urban watershed hydrology. Precipitation that falls on rooftops and pavements runs off instead of infiltrating the soil as it generally would. Additionally, runoff volume, magnitude, and frequency of local flooding increases. However, even though this information has been studied, impacts of the extent and spatial distribution of impervious elements are not well understood. The primary objectives of this study were to determine the hydrological impacts due to the replacement of pervious soil surfaces with impervious cover. To your far left, you can see the picture which I will be now talking about. Each plot consisted of 4 segments 1 meter in length, having either a soil surface, S, or impervious cover, I. Each configuration was tested at a 50% impervious coverage. Additionally, undeveloped or 0% impervious slope plots, SSSS, which is what they're annotated as, were tested. Treatments were performed under 2 different initial soil moisture content levels, dry, D, and wet, W. The boxes were arranged on a 5% slope so that runoff and sediment flowed from upslope to downslope soiled boxes through short flumes. Well-hinged interbox sampling devices allowed runoff and sediment from each of the 4 individual boxes. Soil was also allowed to free drain through holes in the bottom of the soil boxes. Runoff volumes were determined by gravimetric methods using the difference between the weight of the total sample and the weight of the dried bottle of sediment. Runoff rates were determined by dividing respective weights by the sampling duration. In conclusion, steady-state runoff was achieved more rapidly in wet conditions but wasn't achieved in dry conditions for soil. Impervious, there really wasn't any storage capability, so runoff was more rapidly achieved. Downslope position delivered runoff more quickly and in greater amounts than when soil occupied the downslope position. The SSI treatment did yield significantly higher final runoff rates than ISS or SSSS treatments under high initial soil moisture conditions. Runoff rates were also higher overall when initial volumetric soil moisture was high versus low. What this study basically says is that even though pavement has been used in Harvey to aid in the draining of this water, it doesn't really do that great of a job. It does a great job at moving it, but draining is another issue which soil really does better at. I wanted to include this study to see if impervious surfaces really did aid in flood mitigation compared to actual soil. Because in Harvey, there has been a decrease in vegetation and soil, converting it to developed land, which will be touched on later. Now, for my final case study, I chose to look at the impact of changing environment on drainage system performance, and I'll talk a little bit at the end about why I think this is good and fits in with the previous data that we've seen. I'll start off by saying that higher runoffs have an impact on sewer system performances in terms of higher risk of flooding and decrease of stormwater treatment performance. Now, the impact of climate change and city growth leading to pavement of urban areas is addressed in the research project DIN Out. The first step was analysis to compare the impact of increased rainfall intensities, which is the climate change factor, and pavement of urban areas, which is the urbanization and land use change factors. This case study shown is characterized by alpine climate conditions, which are cold winters and summers with usually intense rainfall. The city has a combined drainage system, so rainwater is either treated at the wastewater treatment plant or discharged to the receiving water. Now, the performance of the system is assessed by means of ponded, which is flooding volume leaving the system. That's seen on the graphs as V flood measured in cubic meters. CSO discharge is seen as VCSO and is also measured in cubic meters. Discharge of total suspended solids load and discharge of ammonium nitrogen load. These performance indicators were chosen because they can be used to express system-wide performance in contrast to values which have to be calculated for each pipe as flow peaks. For this analysis, only selected single rainfall events extracted from 14 years of continuous measurements were chosen. Intensity duration curve and the average intensity were evaluated over 15 and 60 minutes for different returns, as these are typically values to characterize rainfall events. The 15 minutes and the 60-minute intervals have been chosen to account for both flooding and CSO discharge performance. Each 5-minute time step, the rainfall intensity under consideration of climate change conditions, is calculated from original rainfall intensity multiplied with the climate change factor, CCF, which were taken from Del Taffo's previous experiment. Land use change is simulated, again, straightforward as change in impervious of the system. However, these changes can be numerically positive, such as new developments that lead to an increase of paved areas, or negative due to rainwater infiltration or harvesting. Due to this aspect, the bandwidth of this parameter varies from about -40 to +60%. Effective impervious area for future conditions is calculated from current conditions and an area factor. Now, the data I'm going to talk about and interpret next can be seen in the graphs to the far left down below the title. You probably can't see all the numbers that well and how many bars there are, so I will be adding this peer review edited article in my citation, so you can always go there and take a look at it if you're really, really interested and want to interpret things for yourself, or if you're just interested and want to go take a look, I'll be adding it there. Moving on. So for the rainfall events 4 and 8, ponded volume increased by approximately 430%. The increase of overflow and pollution discharge is much less, always being well below 100%. Here it's interesting to see that the impact of increased rainfall intensities, which is that climate change factor, is similar for all rainfall events and all return periods. Impact on ponded volume outreached the impact on discharges. The highest increase can be seen for events 1 and 5 with an increase of about 1,000% and 950% respectively. Here, it's again important to note that this increase in percent is based on a relatively low flooded volume for the baseline system, and this 1,000% and 950% change is for that impervious land cover change. Now, Figure 5 shows such an evaluation for the rainfall events 1 to 4 and for performance indicators VFlood and VCSO. This solidifies the fact that both impacts result in a similar figure when looking into flooded volume, combined sewer overflow discharge, total suspended solid discharge, and ammonia nitrogen discharge. Hence, it's important to look into both aspects, both climate change and impervious cover, when trying to predict future performance of combined sewer systems. What this essentially means is that separate or together, these two factors significantly decrease the ability of a drain to do its job properly. And I find this to be pretty interesting and important, as most of the pavement in Houston is roads to connect all these areas where they're kind of isolated, not really, but there's a lot of roads. And these roads are designated to aid in the distribution and the draining of water. Now, my research question in this, I wanted to use ArcGIS to address how Houston's landscape has developed and changed in regards to urban sprawling over time. I also coupled this with statistical analysis to figure out if current zoning laws have led to the conservation of the natural environment. For my GIS, I really didn't use any tools. I just looked at the data layer that was downloaded from the City of Houston Geographic Information System. The layer that I mainly focused on was imperviousness. You can see it is displayed in the map on the right. The gradient goes from black, meaning no pavement, to a kind of dark pink, meaning that a large percent of that cell is X% impervious. What I mean by this is that this layer is basically composed of cells. The cells represent areas of land. Each cell is approximately 30 meters. The measurement of imperviousness was in percentages. For example, if 900 cells, which you would be able to get by opening the attributes table and going to statistics, you would multiply that by 30 to learn that 27,000 meters are 0% impervious. That's basically the data that I used to create the graph that you see to the left of the maps. The maps themselves were just visual displays to show you kind of what I was seeing when I was looking at this impervious layer. Anyways, as you can see, most of the land is 1 to 10% impervious, and I estimate this to be because these are lower developed areas like connecting roads. There are a lot of not secluded neighborhoods, but there are a lot of far neighborhoods that have to be connected to the main city of Houston. So there's a lot of roads that connect these things. In all, there's about 16% of land in Houston is impervious land. So I was hoping that this data would kind of give you an idea of just how much pavement there actually is in Houston, Texas. When looking at the map, you can really see just how much 16% means, like for an area like Houston. The numbers themselves may not be that big, but when you look at it in context, you can get the perspective that the problem is really much deeper than numbers can show. The recent impervious data from 2011, coupled with the damage Harvey did to Houston, which is close to $190 billion, I think it's safe to assume that Houston really has not done that great of a job saving these natural areas, such as wetlands and natural vegetation, that could have absorbed this excess water. But just how much of the vegetation has changed? What I looked at for this was the NLCD land cover in 1992 to 2011. And I went to the actual website for this and just kind of looked around to see kind of what they included in each of their factors, just because I was curious. But basically, over this 20-year period, I wanted to see just how much of the natural land was paved away at. And that's kind of what's shown in the first map. The first map is 1992 and all the developed areas that are present during that time. The green represents all the lush vegetation. Again, the gray is developed areas, and the blue is just all the natural water that's in there that I included because I didn't want you to think that it was vegetation, because it's not. Now, the map that I'm going to layer on top of it and that you can see here has included red. This is basically all the vegetation that was paved over and changed. In 1992, it was vegetation, and in 2011, it was changed to pavement. So these are the natural areas that basically were paved away at. Hint, hint, at the title! I love when that happens, don't you? Okay, moving on. Yeah, that was stupid. This may be hard to put into context just by looking at it, so I did crunch the numbers on this as well, just like I did with the Olympic pools. So basically I looked at 3 types of natural vegetation, which was scrub/shrub, wetlands, and forest. And what I did was the green bars represent what it is at 2011. So basically all the vegetation it has in each of the categories during 2011. And the red that you see is the amount of that type that was lost from 1992. So it really puts into context just how much vegetation was paved over. A big chunk of it was wetland and forest, which I don't think was very beneficial to Houston or Texas at all, considering the amount of flooding that they get. I think, in conclusion, this just kind of solidifies the idea that development really hasn't been going in the right way for Texas in regards of flooding, and it still isn't going in the right way, which has been seen to cause a lot of property damage. They're going to need a lot of money to rehabilitate all of these areas and all the people included in such. You've seen the natural and mental, the physical and mental consequences that these hurricanes can bring around, and I just feel like it's really not that beneficial what Houston Harvey has been doing. These are all of my citations if you wanted to go and have a look at those. If you were interested in any of the information that I talked about, you can go ahead and type those titles into Google Scholar and it will pull up them for you. Sorry for going over time. I really wanted everyone to have a good general idea of what my opinions are on this matter and what I think the best thing to do for Houston. In my personal opinion, I do feel like Houston really needs to look at where their development is going and who is pushing for that development, and kind of step back and also take into consideration the environmental aspects that they seem to be neglecting every time that they develop something. Alright, that is it for the duration of this video. Thank you everybody for watching. I know you didn't have to, but I'm hoping that you did because you were either interested or just wanted to learn a little something new. I do hope that I gave you enough information to know about what I'm talking about. That is what I tried to do, and I'm sorry if anything confused you, or if you have any questions, you can comment them below or try to get in touch with me. I'd like to thank the Academy for this opportunity, and I'd like to thank myself for working so hard at this. It is 4 a.m. I'm done with it. I'm super proud. Peace, love, and happiness. Have a nice day.